Okay, we have with us Aruna Roy from Devdunri village in Rajasthan, who has been, among other things, been able to take the right to information from Jan Sunwais or public hearings at the village level to all the way to national legislation that encompasses all of India. And it is a movement that is truly global in scale. I have therefore the opportunity to bring Aruna Roy before the audience of Himal Southasian website. Welcome, and welcome Aruna. I would like to start by asking you a question that has been troubling me quite a bit in the context of seeing development work, particularly in Nepal, from where I work. There seems to be a progress towards the death of activism in so many ways, sometimes because of the whole format of funding rather than doing something from the heart. Sometimes they can be party affiliations. Other time, development activities have become more careers than a calling or a activistic calling. So for all these reasons, there seems to be an ongoing weakening of activism, at least in this arena that I see. How would you respond to that?
Well, I know only India very well, and I can't speak for the rest of the countries. I think there was a lot of confusion in the early 70s when people of my generation began working for issues of poverty, hunger, for fighting against injustice at various levels, and we didn't quite realize the impact of funding on one's action, particularly if one worked for political action. And it's at that time that I really started looking at India's history. And in the growth of the national movement, actually, we did have a Gandhi who refused to take office. And he did opt out of traditional political structures, but kept what, for want of a better word, I like to call conscience politics, in which you define your ideology or your commitment and your principles, and you speak for it regardless, and you are in the political domain, but you don't form a part of a party political process. And I think that strong process continues to survive in India, despite the fact that all the things you mentioned are happening. It is surviving, and there are many of us now who, for the freedom and for the sheer pleasure of being able to say what one thinks is right, will not want to be in any one of these other paradigms. But of course there are other historical reasons why things may be up or down at a particular point of time, but I don't think in India it's gone down. In fact, I would say that in today's India, there is greater clarity about, in the last decade and a half, actually more than that, 2 decades, that if you take funding, then your capacities are limited. Because if you want to work even with integrity within a funding system, then you have to look at projects, funding, reports, you go to do accounts, and you can't follow the logic of the people to its end. You have to follow the logic of the funding. So it may be together sometimes, but very often it is divergent.
But you yourself have been leading the politicization of people's movement as the way to go ahead, and the example for that, and politicization as understood by yourself, rather than party politics. This is my understanding, that the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, the MKSS, is actually a very political grassroots organization that looked at the entry point being right to information, but it is much more than that. But tell us a little bit about how MKSS fits into this paradigm of activism that you are promoting.
You see, MKSS tries to, well, actually it began in a very simple way. It decided what not to do. There very little to decide on what it would do. And I think there my feminist, my being, I can't call it a background, my feminist being and the emphasis on organic processes of participatory leadership, on participatory decision making, on the collective being more important than an individual, had a strong hold on Shankar and Nikhil, who I think are also feminists in that.
This is Shankar Singh and Nikhil
Day, who were the colleagues with whom I went to Devdunri. they also believed in this. So when we actually began working, we didn't want to define the nature of this struggle or the movement or the campaign with our people. So the first 3 years, we just participated in a number of campaigns with people on land, on minimum wages, things which they defined as priority. And through the struggles, the need for an organization logically emerged. So the organization was then defined with people. So there were more than 6 meetings held in 1 year where we debated on the structure, the composition, the decision-making process. And the MKSS then located itself as a political organization, because we then defined politics not within just the political process of electioneering and parties, but outside of it as fighting within the framework of constitutional rights and positioning ourselves with the poor, for the poor, the marginalized, the disenfranchised, the minorities, the Dalits, the women.
So what makes it political?
The political is that how you see an issue. The same issue can be seen in 10 different ways. Right to information, for instance, can be just a seminar done by academics. It can be done a workshop done by social people who are funded to spread the word about awareness about RTI. It can be the struggle of an individual fighting for his or her rights with the state, with the government office. It can be a poor person fighting for the denial of rights, that will be a denial of life and liberty. It can be the fight of a large collective on issues. So we would then not be party to the first couple of you mentioned. We would be part of the latter bit, where it would be seen as part of a democratic struggle to see that there was both no arbitrary use of power and no corruption, so that the system delivers as per its obligation to the people. So it becomes a political.
And that requires organizing. That's also what makes it political. That it's a group acting for a goal. Even though it is not through a party.
Even an individual independently working must understand that it's just not merely settling of a corruption issue, but by asking that question, they actually ask questions of the state and the government, which have larger implications.
So why did you settle on right to information as your entry point? Why is right to information so seminal that addresses many of the other issues of poverty, corruption, good governance? That is very true. Is that because of your experience at the ground level, at the village level, among your Rajasthani friends and colleagues and peasantry, that they felt that this was the way to go?
Actually, the thing is that it's evolved. That's why I made that first statement about feminism, because it has to evolve from a growth process and a thought. It can't just come from somewhere. And though many of us felt that secrecy was terrible, we have something called the Official Secrets Act, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, obviously. Whereas the British rule, Africa, they've left that great gift to us is an Official Secrets Act. So every time you asked for information from the government, you came up against this block. So we were all aware that that act needed to be set aside and more transparency to come. In fact, the VP Singh government had tried to enact a right to information law. So there's a history. But what actually sharpened this was the struggle for minimum wages that the MKSS was organizing and fighting in rural Rajasthan. Time and again, people were told they were liars. And the official records became terribly important to prove both their integrity and to get a right to a livelihood or a right to a wage, which meant food, which meant staving off hunger, which meant living a reasonable life. So at that point, it became a critical issue, but the definition of that actually came from many people. But I'd like to quote Sushila here. Sushila really defined it in 1996 after a 40-day strike, not a hunger strike, a strike, sit-down strike in Biawar. We formed a national campaign for people's right to information. We went to Delhi for a press conference and she was asked, what are you doing here? You only passed your 4th class. You don't know anything about academics. It's a big, very intellectual question. You're talking about freedom of expression and Article 19 of the Indian Constitution. But she said to them, look, when I send my son the 10 rupees to the marketplace, when he comes back, I ask for accounts. The government spends billions of rupees in my name. Shouldn't I ask for my accounts? And she said in Hindi, Hamara paisa, hamara hisab. So she said, it's our money, it's our accounts. So it's this simple commonsensical logic that actually defined the right to information. Then it acquired all the other various layers of legislation, of an understanding, which spread further, it spread to every aspect of governance. Today it's one of the best used laws in India. But it grew from a commonsensical perception of people. If I may just add one favorite quotation of mine these days, Eduardo Galeano, one of the greatest, I think, political thinkers of South America and I think the world, says that nothing goes from top to down except drilling of holes. He says everything else, which is of any meaning, grows from bottom up. So I think RTI has come to stay because it has been developed and fashioned, and the do's and don'ts and the non-negotiables have been defined by people who suffer the most from arbitrary governance.
This talking of bottom to up, this journey of right to information, RTI, from villages of Rajasthan into the national legislation, and now a countrywide application throughout a country as large as India, 1.1 billion plus, is a global event. And it is a tantalizing story, and we all know, if we do a little bit of research, we can know exactly how it went step by step. So rather than go through the step-by-step process of Rajasthan to becoming national legislation and now being looked at with envy or with a lot of attraction from all around the world and all around South Asia, I'd like to ask Aruna ji, what is the spread now around the country and what are the challenges faced? Because I would expect you need to, it's not enough to have legislation, you got to watchdog it, so make sure that it does what it is meant to do. So how much has it spread and what are the challenges?
Actually, I was quite amazed that it has spread to all sorts of sectors. Say from the very poor to the very, very sophisticated.
All over India?
I wouldn't say all over India, but there are sufficient number of groups all over India who use it. But the groups I'm talking about are people who are the most oppressed. So it's the Dalits who use it for atrocities against them. You have the poor using it to access food and shelter. You have minorities accessing it for their rights, as in Gujarat. People who were victims of the genocide have used RTI. And recently I went to Manipur, and even though there is an Armed Forces Special Powers Act which restricts everything there, the women who are gun widows, because they're widows because of so-called insurgency victims, they use RTI for accessing their minimum needs. No one knows us, no one knows the MKSs, no one knows Aruna Roy or Nikhil or Shankar, but the joy that it gives me then is that it is an act which is now in many places seen what it should be used for logically by the poor. But there are some untoward and very sad incidents, and we've lost about 15 RTI activists who've been killed in the process of accessing information. So actually they have accessed sensitive information. There are many of them single people, in the sense that they have not worked with groups, and therefore they have been identified and killed. Now we are fighting for some kind of protection for those activists, either through an extension of the Whistleblowers Act or some other kind of new legislation which will cover their issues. But it is a huge problem, and it also proves that it's a political act. That no innocent act of just asking for information would lead to this. And I'd just like to add one little incident which has just come to my mind, and that is that you know that the Bombay terror attack, and we lost 3 important policemen, and one of the widows of one of those very eminent policemen was given a martyr's funeral. She couldn't access his post-mortem report from the police station. Husband being a policeman, ex-policeman, she couldn't access the post-mortem report except through RTI. So it's the use of RTI.
So the example from Manipur to Bombay, would you say that it may not have happened everywhere yet, but the Right to Information Act has the possibility of seeping to the capillaries, so that it covers the accountability at the national level, but the accountability at the village level, which means in India it is a humongous terrain and a lot of people. So is it in the process of seeping to the capillaries?
I like that phrase. Yes, it has seeped to the capillaries, because my nephew went trekking in the Himalayas and went to Lahul and Spiti, saw that there were villages which had a community of villages which had one person who was an RTI facilitator who helped them write applications. So he came and told me that it's reached the
So it's a
top
true
of the
catalytic action that
Yes.
where soon you may not even know, and you may already not yourself know all that is happening
Well,
in this arena.